All right, so let's have a look at the evidence section of the research investigation. So everybody should be able to get 5 out of 5 for this. I think this is the easiest part. Firstly, you need to have sufficient and relevant evidence. Now, sufficient evidence, whilst it's not set in stone, we generally look for 3 different sources with 3 different data sets. It's okay if they can be from the same authors. Sometimes they are, if you've got a niche subject and that this person's an expert or these authors are experts. And look, sometimes there really is only 2 sources, but that's obviously a limitation you talk about. Generally, we want to look at 3, and really, in the scheme of things, that's really not a lot. A meta-analysis might have 20, 30, 50 papers. Okay, and you want to look at relevant evidence. Now, what do we mean by relevant? It's relevant to the unit. So for the FA3, it's relevant to Unit 2, and the IA3, it's relevant to Unit 4. Okay, the next thing we need to do is you need to ensure there's thorough identification of relevant trends, patterns, relationships in the evidence. So thorough, that's the word you've got to keep coming back to. Thorough. And the last thing is you need to also look at thorough and appropriate identification of limitations of the evidence. So we're going to talk about that in a little bit, but limitations in terms of what are the limitations of this study that limit your ability to be able to answer your research question. Okay, so let's have a look at my exam plan. Okay, so I have a subheading here that says evidence. I highly recommend, instead of you saying evidence 1, evidence 2, just grab a small descriptor title for the paper. What it does is just signposts where you're going from one paper to the next, and it kind of briefly tells the reader what you're talking about. Now, the next thing is I always recommend that you introduce the paper with the authors. Now, you don't need to credential the authors or the where they went to school or where they published the paper like you might do in your history type subjects, social science. You don't credential the authors by saying this person has a PhD in microbiology. You don't need to do that. The paper stands by itself and the evidence stands by itself. So just introduce it by the authors and talk about the paper, but don't credential the authors or the journal. Okay, not required. Waste words. It's not one of the genre conventions in writing scientifically. And then what I do is I just do a summary in terms of what did they do in the study? What type of study was it? What did they look at? What did they measure? And how many people were involved? So there's just, that's essentially one sentence, but it's pretty dense and it's a really nice summary of what was involved. You'll see that there's a big gap here. That's because you never split a figure or a table across 2 pages. So it's just the way it is. What you want to do here is, instead of tabbing down or pressing return, put in and you insert a page break. Okay, it's much cleaner that way. All right, and so then we're down here and our figure, so basically we're introducing it, and then we're going to show the data, and then we're going to thoroughly explain that data, describe the trends and relationships. Okay, so in figure, and it's figure 1 because it's the first figure, in bold, underneath it in italics. This is the APA format, and every word is capitalized, and then I've just got the reference after it. Try and make the table or graph as big as you can. I probably could even make that bigger by actually just cutting it in here, cutting in here. Okay, so make it as big as you can and center it. That looks better. Don't have it like you would see in a newspaper where you have the text wrapping around it. And you'll also note that I've removed the figure title that was provided by the paper. All right, in terms of describing trends, thinking about describing the trends that help answer your research questions. So there might be stuff that you're not going to talk about, and that's okay. just point the reader in terms of looking at, show them where to look to find the information. So what I've done first of all is said the most, I guess probably the most important in the summary, and I've done it in terms of what the main finding was. So the ongoing pregnancy rate was statistically significantly higher for this group compared with this group because the p-value was below the threshold of significance. So that's really quite dense there, isn't it? And then I've said that's the main finding, and then I've talked going into more detail about the I guess the nuances of it, because that's where we get a thorough description. Okay, so now I've talked about each of the different groups. So these are the women over 40, and I've said the same thing, and I've said the same thing for these groups of women as well. So point is, thorough means that we're covering off on all of the important aspects. Then the next thing we do is we talk about limitations. Okay, so limitations in terms of the quality of the data. Normally you can find this information in the study because the authors will have a section in their paper talking about their own limitations. So you just go to your papers and then Command F, and that gives you a search, and then we can go to limitation, and we'll see we need to find where they're talking about their limitations. Okay, so just search through. We nonetheless acknowledge there are some limitations with the data. Okay, so then you can talk, it may well be appropriate for you to use these limitations, the limitations that they say of their study. But also you might be looking at things like small sample size. You might be looking at the age of the paper. So this paper was from 2012, and it was looking at data from 10 years before that. So you could say that it might be out of date. So the way I do this is I firstly say there are several limitations with this study, and then I say firstly, and then I say what the limitation is, and then secondly. Okay, so that just kind of signposts in a nice structured way to do it. Now, you want to tell me why it's a limitation. So tell me what the limitation is, and then tell me what the impact of that is. So it was a small sample size. This reduces statistical power. Okay, and yeah, so I've only got two limitations. That's fine. Okay, tell me what the limitation is in some detail, and tell me why it's a limitation. Okay, now you're going to rinse and repeat for the other two studies as well. Okay, so the information here that we get in terms of what the study did, you're going to get that information from the abstract. So you don't need to read the whole paper. Read the abstract. So here's that second paper here by Kang, and you can see you get you can identify everything that you need just by looking at the abstract. This one is has got a number of sections. Sometimes it's just a block, but it says that it was a retrospective study. Okay, comparing IVF outcomes, frozen embryo transfers, and it's talking about the number of patients. Okay, and also down here it makes a point of the age of the patients as well. Okay, so everything that you need there to introduce the study. And then we're going to put in the table. This time it's a table. Okay, and then what the main findings were. Again, a paragraph, and then the limitations. Okay. Now, also, I'll just show you here that what I've done is I've linked back to the first paper, but I didn't say not consistent with evidence 1 or article 1, but I've actually said consistent with Foreman et al. Okay, because that was Foreman, was this paper. Okay, so so don't say consistent with evidence 1 or not consistent, say not consistent with Foreman. And then we're going to do the same thing with the third. Probably don't need the space here. What they did. Okay, present the table. Just so you know, when we have an asterisk like this, it means that that's statistically significant. Okay, so it might not actually say what the p-value is sometimes, like this one here. Oh yeah, this actually does say the p-values, but sometimes it's just got an asterisk, and if it's an asterisk, it means that it's less than 0.05 significance. But if it was 2 asterisks, then that means it's less than 0.01. Okay, and so then we've got our third paper, and again the same thing. We've got a title, we've got what did they do, we've got our evidence, and then we've got our thorough description of the trends, patterns, trends, patterns, relationships, and then a thorough description of the limitations. And then we're on to our evaluation.